You see there is something quite extraordinary, talking about the connection between urban and rural, that carbon emissions per capita are quite low in big cities like New York, where I live, and quite low in rural areas. It's everything in between where you really see the problem, right? And what's interesting is, I mean, there are many people here who know rural America. But you think about rural America, even though it's spread out, it's still conservation culture. You don't get into your truck and drive 80 miles to get a quart of milk. You really think about how you use resources. It's in that zone in the middle where everything from landscaping to the heating and cooling of small single-family homes, where you get into more and more trouble in terms of carbon emissions. And so, you know, sprawl really is a big issue. As I said, I've driven cross-country 6 times. It's amazing how much of this very beautiful country we are losing to kind of this anonymous form of development. And the thing is that no matter how much green tech you add to it, no matter how many solar panels and electric cars and windmills you add to it, you can't deal with the other forms of loss that come with living on more land than you need to live on, right? From loss of wetlands, loss of farming, and loss of community, which I'm going to talk about more in a second. The other thing is sprawl is largely what we build in terms of housing in this country. You'll remember the housing crisis of the 2000s. It's not making housing more affordable. I hear this time and time again, that we can't afford especially young people, older people who are maybe empty nesters, can't afford to live anymore, and so we need to build more suburban subdivision. Well, show me a piece of data that shows that that somehow made life more affordable for Americans. You can't find it. And in the last 5 years, and I think this actually fueled a lot of kind of the political anger that went into this last election. I mean, think about this, that to own the average home in the United States, your salary needed to nearly double over the last 5 years. And that is a real crisis for our children, our grandchildren, in terms of how they're going to afford to live in the country. And so I think we need to take a big step back and think about how we do this as a society. One of my favorite economists, because she draws with a pencil, named Kate Raworth, she teaches at Oxford. She wrote this great little book that I really recommend called Donut Economics. And she draws this diagram. And she basically says, if we're going to think about the world growing in the ways we just described in terms of population, let's not just talk about growth for growth's sake, but think about how we could all live. And she basically argues that we should all try to live inside of that donut. Right? That if you undershoot that donut, people have shortfalls in terms of how they live, whether they can afford to give their kids basic necessities, education, healthcare, and so forth. But if you overshoot the donut, you use more resources than the planet can really afford to give you. And so the problem we have, it seems to me, in our society is that most people either live on one side of this donut or the other. And very few of us actually think about whether we can live inside of the donut. And that's a real crisis if you've got a growing world. So I was born in India. My parents emigrated here in the 60s as part of a huge kind of chain of events that happened worldwide. By about the mid-1990s to now, about 2 billion people have entered the middle class worldwide. China, India, Turkey, Russia, Brazil, you name it. The only issue is a lot of those folks that have made it out of poverty, which is a great thing, have decided that their definition of success is one that we kind of created here of the single-family house and a couple of cars in the driveway. And just think about it. I mean, think about if billions of people decide to live that way around the world. So these are 6 images from 6 continents around the world. And so, to me, this is a real tragedy in terms of how we think about the beauty of the planet and how we use it. And you can see the same thing, whether you go outside of Riyadh or you go outside of Phoenix, an irrigated desert where we're building this. Now, I've been beating up on suburbs, but I don't think our cities are doing much better. And this is what I mean about identity. These are 6 cities from around the world and downtowns, and they are becoming equally banal, equally kind of nameless and placeless, where you land and you see the same Starbucks at the bottom of the same blue glass building, and you don't know whether you're in Shanghai or Dubai or Mumbai. It's all kind of the same. And yet, the pandemic should prove something to all of us, which is, when the telephone was invented, people thought that would be the end of cities, that we'd all work from the mountaintop. And then we had this ultimate test during the pandemic, right? Where we have the technology to supposedly seamlessly work without having to be in the same space. And yet, in every city I go to around the country, you can't get a restaurant reservation. It's incredible, right? We like doing this. You could have all seen this online, right? But we do this as a species. We like to be with one another. And we have, since the beginning of really antiquity, since we became Homo sapiens, built what I would call urbanity. We've built different forms of collective living on every continent, every culture, right? And we've done this primarily not just for economic reasons, for trade. Because if we did it just for trade, all of these places would have looked the same. But they don't. They have all sorts of interesting and different cultural norms. In ancient China, if you went north on the grid, you were ascending to the heavens. In ancient India, if you spiraled in the grid, you were finding spirituality at the center. William Penn founded the grid of Philadelphia based on the idea of an egalitarian grid that was designed in ancient Athens. And so we've been creating urban form as a species for a long, long time. And so I want you to do something with me as we go on this journey, which is to separate the idea of urbanity from size. So if I say the word urban, you probably would think big, city slickers, wearing black, flying in from Manhattan. But I'm going to argue that urbanity is a cultural condition. And it can be just as manifest in a small town in Japan as it could. Anyone recognize the center slide? Goodwood, Canada, otherwise known as, anyone? Schitt's Creek. Or the densest place in the world, one of the greenest places in the world, Hong Kong. It can happen at all scales. And I pulled back this picture specifically for this lecture. I took this picture flying out of Narita Airport years and years ago outside of Tokyo. This is a farming village in Japan, and it's actually very similar to the farming village that my father grew up in India, where if you take a close look at that picture, that is basically the idea of an urban growth boundary without it being legally enforced, but it being culturally enforced. And just think about infrastructure. Think about the fact that all the farmers, after they farm their land, they come back and they have one line of infrastructure in terms of water, sewer, power. But that line is also their cultural connection to each other, right? And so this idea of urbanity has nothing to do with size. So in my most recent book, I talk about urbanity not about size, but actually about this idea of urbanity being this thing that celebrates difference. And that can happen in a small village or a big metropolis, or you can segregate difference, and that can happen in a small village, or it can happen in a big metropolis. And I talk about urbanity as opposed to community because in our field, in architecture and urban planning, we talk about community a lot. Community is a very important idea. But sometimes the challenge with the idea of community is that we get tribal, right? We like to hang out with people who think like us, who pray like us, who vote like us. And we already have a set of algorithms in social media that are already doing this to us. So we don't need to reinforce it in physical space. We have this other data, and thank you to the AARP for sponsoring us, in terms of public health and mental health. Because there's all this data. There's a great book called The Good Life that talks about longevity and people having a good life through many decades. It's one of the longest studies of human happiness ever conducted at Harvard University. And it found that if you controlled for things like smoking and exercise, that the other big variable was social connection, right? The ability for people to have strong social connections is imperative in terms of longevity and public health. So as an architect, I asked myself, what are the spaces that create great social connection? And I think urbanity has a lot to do with that.